Hello folks, Dan here. I hope that you enjoyed the readings of Finn and Ocean from the 1955 edition of the Collier Junior Classics, Volume 4. Today, I would like to return to that same volume and visit a different part of the world and time period, and read for you from the Song of Roland. Roland was the most famous of what would come to be known as the 12 Peers of Charlemagne, the Holy Roman Emperor who would go on to unite all of Europe for the first time since the classical era of the Roman Empire. The tales of Roland and his fellow peers gave us a timeless example of a character type we've grown accustomed to referring to as a paladin or a pious holy warrior of God. As Adobe Kroger herself, in Mythoverse continuity, is a direct descendant in arms from Charlemagne and his 12 peers, I was very excited to have a chance to read this, the Song of Roland, for you. And now, the Song of Roland, the greatest of the hero poems of France. Part 1, Roland and Oliver, by James Baldwin. Illustrations by Reginald Birch. 1. The Vow of Brotherhood. One summer afternoon, rather more than 1,100 years ago, the boy Roland was sitting in the cleft of a broken rock that forms the crest of one of the hills in the neighborhood of Sutri. Above him was the deep blue sky of Italy, unflecked by any cloud. On either side of him stretched a dull, uneven plain, broken here and there by wet marshes and long lines of low hills. A mile or more to the south, and partly hidden behind the brow of the hill, could be seen the old town with its strong castle and its half-ruined amphitheater and its white-walled monastery. Directly beneath him was the dusty high road which, after winding among the straggling vineyards and the little farms that dotted the plain, was lost to sight in a strip of dusky woodland a league and more to the northward. Along that road, King Charlemagne, with the flower of his great army, was hourly expected to pass, marching on his way to the castle of Sutri, where he was to be entertained for a time as a guest. And it was for this reason that the lad sat so still and watched so long in his half-hidden perch on the hilltop. Everything, as if awed by the near coming of the hero king, seemed strangely still that afternoon. Scarcely a sign of life was to be seen, and the places which at other times had been noisy with busy workers were now silent and deserted. The reapers, who yesterday had made the wheat fields ring with their gay jests and their rude songs, had left their sickles in the fields and stolen silently away. The young girls, who had been gleaning the fallen grain, and whose laughter had awakened the echoes among the hills, were nowhere to be seen today, although the eagle eyes of Roland sought them on every hand. Along the high road, which at other times seemed alive with the busy folk coming and going between Sutri and Viterbo, neither man, woman, nor beast was stirring. But off towards Sutri the boy could see that things were quite different. The town seemed to be decked in holiday attire. The governor's castle was draped with gay bunting, and flags and banners floated from the turret tops. Companies of knights, dressed in rich livery, rode hither and thither, impatiently waiting the word from the watchman above the gates to go out and meet the kingly guest. The streets were crowded with hurrying, eager folk who knew not whether to hail the coming of Charlemagne and his host as a blessing or to look upon it as a calamity. Now and then the sound of voices from the town or the cries of the soldiers in the garrison came to Roland's ears, and anon he heard the monks in the monastery drowsily chanting their prayers. And there he sat, waiting and wondering, and anxiously watching for any sign of the coming host. The fair face of the lad and the long flaxen hair, which fell in glistening waves upon his bare shoulders, showed his kinship to the hardy races of the north. And there was something in the piercing look of his eye, and the proud curl of his lip, and the haughty turn of his head, which made him seem like a young king among men, and which often had caused those who met him to doff the hat in humble courtesy. He was very poorly clad, his head and limbs were bare, and the thin, scant clothing which covered his body was naught but rags and shreds. Yet he bore himself proudly, as one who knew his own worth, and who, having a blameless heart, had nothing of which to feel ashamed. And now the sun began to slope toward the west, and, with each moment that passed, the lad's eagerness seemed to grow greater. By and by, another boy came over the crest of the hill and stood in the cleft of the rock by the side of Roland, and with him gazed down the deserted road. He seemed to be of about the same age as Roland, and, like him, was tall and sparely built. His dark hair and overhanging brows, his ruddy face and flashing eyes, betokened an equal kinship with the danger-daring Northfolk and the leisure-loving people of the South. He wore the rich dress of a court page, and carried himself with a lofty grace such as only those who bear brave hearts can ever show. "I feared you were not coming, Oliver," said Roland, offering his hand, but not once turning his head or taking his eyes from the distant woodland. "It was indeed hard for me to get leave," answered the other, "but the ladies at the castle are very kind, and here I am, and I mean to be with you the first to see the great king and his valiant knights. Yet he is late." "I think I see him coming now," said Roland. "There is a glimmering of light among the trees, which I think must be the flashing of the sun upon their armor, and it grows brighter and seems to come nearer." He had scarcely finished speaking when the clear notes of a bugle were heard, borne faintly to them on the breeze, and soon they heard a sound like the distant dashing of waves against the seashore, the rustling of myriads of dry leaves in the autumn woods, the faint rumbling of a faraway storm cloud. They knew that it was naught but the noise made by the trampling of many feet, the heavy tread of war horses, the rattling of arms and armor. Then a great cloud of dust was seen rising like a mist above the treetops, and the rainbow-hued banners of the coming host hove in sight. Presently, the edge of the woods seemed to blaze with flashing shields and glittering war coats. The boy of Roland leapt to his feet. He stood on tiptoe and strained himself eagerly forward. His face beamed with delight, and his eyes sparkled with that strange wild fire which in after days, in the midst of the battle's din, was wont to strike his foes with terror. Oliver climbed to the highest point of the rock and gazed with an eagerness half mixed with fear at the wonderful array of steel-clad warriors who now could be plainly seen issuing from the woodland. Like a torrent of rolling, flashing waters, the host of Charlemagne came moving along the line of the highway and spreading across the plain. They came not, however, in all the array of battle, nor with their terrible engines of war, nor indeed as enemies bent on pillage or seeking revenge. But they came, rather, as an army of peace, with music sounding and banners flying, words of goodwill and friendship to all. For Charlemagne, having left off fighting with the Lombards, was on his way to Rome with the best and bravest of his warriors to receive the homage and the blessing of the Pope. The vanguard of the procession drew rapidly nearer. In front rode 24 knights, the heralds of the king, bearing aloft the silken banner of France and the golden eagle of Rome. They were clad in rich armor, which glittered like gold in the sunlight. Their shields were inlaid with many priceless gems and polished as bright as mirrors, and the sharp points of their long lances flashed around them like the restless gleams of lightning in the van of a summer storm cloud. They were mounted on milk-white horses trapped with white cloth of gold, with gold-red saddles and housings of bluest silk. The boy Roland had never seen anything so beautiful or so grand, and he thought that one of these knights must surely be Charlemagne. And as they drew very near to the foot of the hill, and he could look down almost upon the heads of the brilliant company, he called to Oliver and asked, "Which of these knights is the great Charles? Is it not he who rides nearest the standard-bearer? He surely is the noblest warrior of them all, and he rides with a grace which well becomes a king." But this scene which filled the mind of Roland with such astonishment was not altogether new to Oliver. Not many months before, his father, the governor of Sutri, had taken him on a visit to the court of Charlemagne, and there he had witnessed the splendor of the king's surroundings and had heard of the fearful might of his warriors. "No," he answered, The great king is not one of these. They are but heralds and messengers, who ride before to my father's castle, to see that everything is in readiness for their master. They are right courtly fellows, I ween, fair of speech and comely of form, but I doubt if any of them would be ranked among his bravest knights. Following the heralds came a body of guards, 1,000 men of giant stature and muscles of iron, encased from head to foot in strongest armor, and riding heavy war steeds trapped with steel. After these came a long line of bishops and abbots and monks and priests, most of them dressed in the garb of their office or profession, and riding on the backs of palfreys or of mules. See you the tall bishop, dressed partly in armor and carrying a crucifix in one hand, while with the other he toys with his sword hilt? Asked Oliver. That is the brave Turpin, one of the peers of Charlemagne. He is at home in the battlefield as well as before the altar, and many an unbelieving pagan has felt the thrust of his lance. But see, here comes the king himself. The whole highway and the fields before them now seemed filled with steel-coated men, and horses clothed in steel trappings, and the long lances in the hands of the knights seemed as thick-set as the blades of grass in an autumn meadow. Everywhere were seen the gleam of polished steel, and the waving of gay plumes and many-colored pennons, and here and there were banners of varied shapes and every hue, on which were emblazoned mottos and the strange devices of the warriors who bore them. First and foremost in this company was Charlemagne himself, clad in steel from head to foot, and riding a horse of the color of steel and the strength of steel. Roland, as soon as he saw him, knew that this must be the king, for there was no other man who seemed so kingly or bore himself with so lordly a grace. The noblest knight among his followers seemed but a weak stripling when seen by the side of the matchless Charlemagne. In his left hand he carried a lance of steel, of wondrous length, while his right hand held the reins of his fiery steed. His head was bare, for he had laid aside his helmet, and his long hair fell in waves upon his steel-covered shoulders. His broad shield, which was carried by an attendant knight, was of plated steel of 3 thicknesses bound together with iron bolts. His thighs were encircled with plates of steel, and his hands were garnished with steel gauntlets. On his kingly face a smile lingered, and from his gleaming gray eyes sparks of fire seemed to shoot, and under a weight of armor which would have borne down a common man, he carried himself erect and proud, like one who was every inch a king. With wonder, rather than with awe, Roland kept his eyes fixed upon the noble figure of Charlemagne, and he did not withdraw his gaze until a sudden turn of the road around the hill towards Sutri hid the steel-clad company from his sight. He did not care to see that part of the host which followed. He had no thought for the throng of squires and pages, and the crowd of common soldiers and grooms, who brought up the rear with the baggage and the camp equipage and the led horses of the knights. He had seen the great Charles, and that was all he wished. He beckoned to Oliver, and the 2 boys climbed down from their well-hidden lookout, and started homeward. To keep out of the way of the soldiery, and to shun other hindrances, they followed a narrow pathway which led them over the hill and down a slope on the other side from that where the highway ran. Not a word did either speak until they reached the level fields, but here they paused, for here they must needs part. The path which Oliver was to take led southward to the lordly castle of Sutri, where, that night and the following day, Charlemagne and his warriors were to rest and be entertained. But Roland's way lay across the lonely fields to a far different dwelling among the barren hills. Before they parted, each took the other's hand, and both stood for some time in silence, their hearts full of thoughts too big to find utterance in speech. Roland spoke first. "Some day, Oliver," said he, "we too shall be knights, and we shall ride with Charlemagne and his peers, as proud as the proudest warriors we've seen today." "Yes," answered Oliver, his face beaming with delight, "and boldly will we fare over land and sea, fighting the pagan folk, and doing worthy deeds for the honor of God, the king, and the ladies." "My mother has often told me," said Roland, "that the day when I should first see Charlemagne would be to me the beginning of a new life. I know not why she said it, but I have seen the great king, and I feel that a wonderful change has come to me, and that I shall no longer be a mere beggar boy. I must soon be up and away, doing my part in this busy world. Let us now, like real knights, pledge ourselves as brothers in arms. Next to my mother, you are my dearest friend. Let me call you my brother." "You are indeed my brother, Roland," answered Oliver earnestly. "You are my brother. Don't you remember that, since the day when you gave me such a well-deserved drubbing for laughing at your ragged clothing, we have been sworn brothers in arms? Did anyone ever apologize for a fault more heartily than I did then? And did anyone ever forgive with freer grace than you forgave me? And have any two persons ever loved with a truer love than that which binds us together? But we are only boys," said Roland. "You are a page and a prince. I'm a beggar and a prince, at least so I've been told in my dreams. The next time we meet, we may both be knights. Let us pledge ourselves that, let that meeting be when it may, it shall be a meeting between brothers in arms." Without more words, the two boys, still holding each other's hands, knelt together by the roadside, and they vowed to be true to each other so long as life should last, to share whatever fortune may betide, whether it should be good or ill, to meet all dangers together, and to undertake all great enterprises in company, to rejoice together in success, and grieve together when sorrow should come, to devote their lives to the succor of the helpless, and to the defense of the right, and if need be, to die for each other. "And now," said Oliver, as they rose to their feet, "let us, like true knights, seal our vow of brotherhood by exchanging tokens." And with the word he took from his girdle a little dagger with long gleaming blade, and a handle of ivory richly carved and inlaid with gold. It was a gift from his grandfather, Gerard of Viana, and had once belonged to the pagan king of Morocco. It was the dearest of Oliver's possessions, and hence the fittest token to present to his brother-in-arms. As Roland took it from his hand and gazed with pleased eyes upon its razor edges, gleaming like lines of silver light, tears stood in his eyes, for he knew how highly its owner prized it. Then from the folds of his ragged garment he drew the short, broken fragment of an old sword blade, dimmed with age and much rust, and dull with many notches. "My token," said he, "is but a poor return for the beautiful keepsake you have given me. But it is very dear to me, and I know that it will also be dear to you. It is all that was left of my father's sword when, hemmed in by pagan foes, he sold his life dearly in fight and died for the honor of the king and the church." Oliver took the proffered token reverently, for he already knew its story. He gazed a moment at the curious letters carved on its sides, and at its hacked and battered edge, and then he placed it carefully in his girdle. And the two boys, after many earnest words and many kind goodbyes, turned away, and each hastened toward his own home. By this time the sun had gone down, and the short twilight was fast giving place to darkness. With hasty steps, Roland made his way across the fields toward the low line of yellow hills, which now could be scarcely seen, lying more than a league away, dimly outlined against the west horizon. It was quite dark long before he reached them, but he knew the way well, and a light shining in the door of his mother's dwelling helped to guide his steps across the uneven ground. And what kind of a dwelling was it that Roland called his home? It was nothing more than a little cave hollowed out of the rocky hillside where, long before, a holy hermit had made himself a quiet cell in which to live and worship God. The narrow entrance to the cave was in great part hidden by flowering vines which Roland's mother had with daily care coaxed to grow in the barren soil and had trained to cling to the rough rocks and twine among the crevices overhead. Inside, everything betokened poverty. A single stool, a broken table, a few earthen dishes, the simple articles which the hermit had left, these were the only pieces of furniture. In one corner of the room hung an old set of armor, dinted with many a lance thrust and hacked in many a battle, but still kept bright against a day when Roland should become a knight. Near it leaned a long, broken lance, which had done duty in more than one tourney, and beneath it was a battered shield on which were emblazoned the arms of Charlemagne. The stone floor was bare, and the rough stone walls were grimed with smoke, and the low ceilings were damp with moisture. Few were the comforts of home in that humble dwelling, and but for the kind welcome of his queen-like mother, the Lady Bertha, small would have been the cheer that Roland would have found there. "I have seen him, mother," he cried, rushing into her arms. "I have seen the great Charles, and his glorious army, and his gallant peers. Would that I were a man, that I too might ride forth with the king, the bravest of the brave." Then the gentle Bertha took the lad's hand in her own, and the two sat down together in their lowly dwelling, and Roland told her of all that he had seen that memorable afternoon. But he talked most of the noble Charlemagne, and of his kingly grace and bearing. Then he spoke again of his own hopes and of his high ambition, and of the time when he should be a knight, and, mayhap, one of the peers of the king. "And now, dear mother," said he, "the time has come for me to learn the great secret of my life. Today I am 12 years old enough to be a page. Today I have seen Charlemagne, and today you have promised to tell me all about my kinsfolk and myself, and the great destiny which lies before me." Then the Lady Bertha drew the lad close to her, and told him the story of her own life and his, a story so full of strange surprises to Roland that, when he heard it, he wept for joy and for the big thoughts that came welling up from his heart. She told him that the great king whom he had seen that day, and whose fame was known in every land, was his uncle and her own brother. She told him how she, the spoiled and petted daughter of Pepin, had been brought up at the French court, and how after her father's death she had lived in her brother's kingly palace at Aix, loved and honored next to Charlemagne himself. Then she told how, on a time, there came to Charlemagne's court a worthy knight named Milon, a warrior poor and needy, but brave and without reproach. Milon boasted that his kin had been the noblest heroes of all time. Through his father he traced his descent from the Greeks, and he wore the arms of Trojan Hector engraved upon his shield, and he numbered among his ancestors the godlike hero Hercules. On his mother's side, he claimed kinship with the fair-haired heroes of the north, with the fearless Vikings, with Siegfried the dragon slayer, with the mighty Thor, and the matchless Odin. And when your mother, then the Princess Bertha, saw the gallant Count Milon, and heard of his nobleness and learned of his true worth, she loved him. And your uncle Charlemagne hated him, and banished him from France, and sought even to take his life, for he wished to wed his sister to Duke Ganelon of Mayence, one of his peers. But when Milon fled from the king's court at Aix, he went not alone. He took me, the Princess Bertha, and with him as his wife, for the good Archbishop Turpin had secretly married us, and given us his blessing, and promised to help us on our way to Italy. When Charlemagne heard how he had been outwitted, he was very angry, and he swore that he would do his uttermost to ruin Count Milon, and to bring me back to France, and make me the wife of the hated Ganelon. And so, to escape his anger, we dressed ourselves in the guise of beggars, and wandered on foot from town to town and through many countries, begging for our bread. And wherever we went, we met the spies of Charlemagne seeking for Milon, and offering a price for his head. At last we came to Sutri, tired and footsore, and unable to go any farther. And, when none would take us into their houses, we found shelter in this wretched cave, which we fitted up with the best that we could, to serve as a home until we could soften the anger of Charlemagne and obtain his forgiveness. But soon after you were born, Roland, the pagan folk crossed the sea and came into Italy and threatened Rome itself. Then your father, the gallant Milon, remembering his knightly vows, once more donned his armor, and taking his lance and his shield, he went out to do battle for the king and for the Holy Church. You know the rest. You know how bravely he fought, and how he died as heroes die, with his face toward the foe. All this I have told you often, and you know how we have lived these long, weary years in this wretched hermit cell, dependent on our kind neighbors for food, and hoping always for brighter and better days. And now you have learned the story of your birth and your kinship, and you know the destiny that is yours if you but do your part. The blood that flows in your veins is the blood of heroes, and it will not belie itself. You have seen Charlemagne, and today is a turning point in your life. Before the king leaves Sutri, he must acknowledge you as his nephew and take you as page into his court. Then mother and son sat long together in the quiet cell, talking of the past so fraught with distress and poverty and wretchedness, and of the unknown future with its vague promises and uncertain hopes. But so great was the lad's trust in his own strength, and so firm was the mother's faith in her son, that not once did clouds of doubt darken the bright pictures which their fancy painted of the good fortune yet in store for them. And the little candle which lighted the humble room burned down and left them in darkness, and the moon rose over the hills and peeped in through the doorway and sloped downward towards the west, and the stars, one by one, looked in between the vines, and then went onward in their endless journey around the world. And at length the eastern sky began to brighten and then to blush at the coming of the sun, and still the Lady Bertha and the boy Roland sat, unmindful of the passing hours, and talked of the new life which they felt must soon be theirs. But when the morning had fairly come, and the first rays of the sun shot in upon them, Roland, as if suddenly awakened, sprang to his feet and cried, "Mother, the night is past and the day is dawned, the first day in the great new life which is mine. I will go at once to my uncle, the king, and demand my rights and yours." And with his mother's blessing and many a word of advice well fixed in his memory, the lad hurried away, walking rapidly across the fields towards Sutri. This concludes today's reading of Roland and Oliver Part 1. We will resume with Part 2, The King's Guest, in our next video. Thank you for listening. Stay safe and stay healthy.